This is George Galloway for كلمة on Al-Mayadeen Television, coming to you from London. Coming to you from London. I'm George Galloway, presenting كلمة where every word is free. Welcome to كلمة with me, George Galloway, for Al-Mayadeen Television here in London, with an audience of distinguished experts and the occasional gifted amateur like myself. Tonight, we're discussing Iraq. We're discussing Tony Blair from London, where he practiced his foul crimes. We're discussing whether or not he made an apology for the Iraq war. And furthermore, would an apology do it for you? How do you apologize for killing 1 million people, for destroying a country, for sending fanaticism cascading around the region and the world, for extremising millions of people across the whole world? You apologize if you stand on someone's toe. You apologize, although you'd be lucky to get away with a simple apology, if you bump their car. But when you cause the deaths of 1 million people and the carnage and destruction that the Bush and Blair invasion and occupation of Iraq caused, what kind of apology would suffice? I have my own views about that. But let me first of all dissect whether or not he actually did apologize. Frankly, he did not. Under no construction of the English language could what he did say to a pet, tame, friendly interviewer in advance of the Chilcot inquiry report into the war on Iraq, which is widely expected to savagely criticize him, can only be called a pre-buttal, not a rebuttal, but a pre-buttal, getting your retaliation in first, making it seem like you are sorry for what has happened without actually being sorry, and certainly without actually saying sorry. He said he was sorry that the intelligence was wrong, but that misses the point that he fixed the intelligence. He gave the orders to the intelligence services to give him the intelligence that he wanted, and when he couldn't get entirely what he wanted, he swept the internet floor for the scribbles of academics in their theses and their various academic and research work. Didn't matter who the person was, didn't matter what nonsense they had produced, it came back to us as intelligence. And after the death of Ahmed Chalabi, the bank robber, who was the leading voice in the Iraqi opposition, in his case based in London, but many of them based around the world, after their lies were discredited not as being intelligence, but falsification, fraud, forgery, fabrication, well, I'm not sure that Mr. Blair's blaming of the intelligence services holds much water. He replaced every question mark in the testimony of his own intelligence services with an exclamation mark. Every time they said could, he said would. Every time they said maybe, he said certainly. He falsified the intelligence that he now wishes to say sorry for the fact that it was wrong. In any case, as one of the leaders of the opposition to the war in Iraq, and some of my comrades from that period are with us in the audience tonight, I repeatedly made the point that if what Mr. Blair was saying about Iraq was true, he wouldn't have invaded it. If Iraq had had weapons of mass destruction, he would never have invaded it. North Korea does have weapons of mass destruction, which is why Tony Blair nor anyone else will ever invade it. The truth is, I believe they knew that what they were saying was false and that they are guilty, therefore, not just of war crimes and crimes against humanity, couldn't be much more serious than that, but the crime of systematically lying to the British Parliament, to the Queen, to the armed forces, to the British public also. From my point of view, there can be no justice without a trial, and that Tony Blair must stand trial with George W. Bush in The Hague, charged with crimes against humanity, war crimes, and he must stand trial in Britain for systematically deceiving the Parliament. He can be called to the bar of the House. He can be found guilty there of having, it's the most grave crime in a parliamentary democracy, set out deliberately to lie and deceive to the lawmakers who followed him. More fool them. My last point before throwing to the audience would be this. None of this came as a surprise to millions of British people, even before they knew what they know now. We were millions on our marches against the war in Iraq when we thought that Iraq must have weapons of mass destruction. We didn't know it was all a lie, but we all knew that it was a very, very grave blunder to invade an Arab Muslim country at a time of rising radicalization and tension between the Muslim world and the non-Muslim world. Little old ladies, little old men, young children, we all knew it. Without the benefit of intelligence services, without the benefit of a string of ambassadors throughout the Arab world who were telling us, or ought to have been, that this was a very bad idea. We just knew it. None of us, even my distinguished experts in the audience, knew that it would turn out just quite as badly as it did, and still is, because don't forget that. It's a long way from the end of this story. More than 1 million are dead. 2 countries have been ruined, wrecked. Other countries far away are feeling the after effects, the aftershocks of the crime committed by Tony Blair and George W. Bush. You'll have noticed that I mentioned Blair first. That's because Blair doesn't have the alibi that George Bush has of being stupid. George Bush is inches from being an imbecile, and therefore could argue that he's not really responsible for his words or his actions. He was too stupid to know. But Tony Blair definitely ain't stupid. And by the way, he's made £100 million profiting from the crimes that he committed. So for me, he needs to go for trial. If he's found guilty, every last penny of that wealth should be taken from him and given to the people of Iraq whose lives he ruined. And he should spend the rest of his life behind bars in one cell with George W. Bush, a fate worse than death. Let me turn now to the audience and get their point of view. One of my comrades from that period, Sabah Jawad, you're first, sir. Go ahead.
Thank you, George. I think millions of people across the world will agree with you totally that actually that what's constituted an apology from Tony Blair was no apology whatsoever. In his interview, he regretted some of the intelligence reports and also so-called mistakes in the planning in the aftermath of the war and occupation of Iraq. And we all know actually that Tony Blair is not apologizing for waging this war in collaboration with President Bush, but to implement an agenda which he allied himself with the conservative in the United States, the extreme conservative in the United States, to actually go to the Middle East and establish a new world order and to basically loot the resources of the Middle East and stay there for the foreseeable future. In fact, Tony Blair is not only not regretting the decision to go to war, he wants to implement more of the same kind of treatment into the Syrians. We already know that what they implemented in Libya and in the whole of the Middle East as well. And this is actually premeditated determination to inflict on Iraq to other part of the Middle East, what's been inflicted on Iraq. And the Iraqi people will be with this situation for the foreseeable future, because even so, the war ended and American withdrew the bulk of their occupation from Iraq, and the British did likewise. They are increasingly getting back into this quagmire because actually they're using the pretext of terrorism, which they brought to Iraq in the first place, to go back and to fight ISIS and so on. While we know for facts ISIS and similar organizations, terrorist organizations, did not exist in Iraq before the invasion of 2003. It's flourishing now, not only in Iraq, it's flourishing everywhere in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, and Libya, and so on. And this is as a direct result of the encouragement and utilization of these terrorist groups actually to destroy countries and for a regime change in many parts of the Middle East, because the policies of these regimes do not suit the Americans and the British governments as well. And there are many examples actually that the United States encourage terrorism in Iraq. We have many statements by American politicians saying we rather fight them here than them coming to us in New York and Washington and London and elsewhere in Western Europe. Let them let us fight them here, and encouraging them actually to utilize them to divide the Iraqi people. As you know, one of the policies of the occupation everywhere is that to divide the people they try to conquer. And by bringing people like a Takfiri terrorist into Iraq, they diverted attention from the occupation forces in Iraq and wanted to create a climate where people fighting each other and different groups fighting each other, while at the same time letting off the American occupation and the British occupation as well. So Tony Blair is not only not apologizing, he wants to repeat what he done to Iraq to other parts of the Middle East with different slogans. Sometimes democracy, sometimes human rights, sometimes weapon of mass destruction, a threat to the West, and so on. They all camouflage for future intervention, and sometimes for humanitarian interventions. And we've seen what the humanitarian intervention in Iraq created, actually. We have millions of people dispersed from their homes and their land. They live in exiles. We have millions of widows in Iraq and children, orphans, and we still corruptions. They brought Ahmed al-Chalabi and thieves like him to rule Iraq for the past 12 years. And actually the Iraqi financial situation is a dire situation. They are asking for huge loans from the International Monetary Fund with the implication of what they have to impose on the Iraqi people and the ordinary people in Iraq in terms of wages, in terms of employment, in terms of retirement and pensions and so on. So all these policy was a direct result of the war and occupation. And before that, actually, let us not forget that they had, before that, imposed an economic sanction on Iraq, which is the most savage economic sanction devised by men in the history of mankind. They subjected to Iraq to this measure for many years, and then on top of it, there is a war and occupation which lasted 8-9 years as well. So Tony Blair deserved to be on trial. He doesn't deserve to be on television screens or making millions of pounds and speaking engagements and so on. He has to be put behind bars because of the crimes he committed against the Iraqi people and against the Palestinian people and against the Lebanese people. Let us not forget that Tony Blair just before he had to resign, he refused to call for a ceasefire in Lebanon because he wanted the Israeli to finish off Hezbollah and the Lebanese resistance. And likewise, his support for the Israeli aggression
Well, he then became the
continues.
so-called peace envoy.
Absolutely. I mean, this is like putting salt on your wounds as far as people in the Middle East are concerned. So there is no amount of apology, even if he apologized properly. There's no amount of apologies is capable of washing his hand of the blood stained by the Iraqi people and the people in the Middle East, which he committed these vile crimes against our people in the Middle East.
Thank you very much for setting the scene, I think, for the rest of the evening's debate. Now, the Stop the War Coalition was the leader of the mass movement, the biggest ever mass movement in British history. And we have Asia Othman from the Stop the War Coalition also with us. Let's hear now from Asia.
Thank you very much for having me here. Just as my comrade, I would say, said, this apology by Tony Blair was by no means an apology. And as you said, Stop the War Coalition was at the forefront of that. That was actually my first march ever as a teenager. You know, it's quite surreal to say that that was my first march as a teenager, and over a decade later, we are still witnessing the consequences of that war. We are still facing, every single day, the rise of so-called terror groups such as ISIS and the likes of them, and that we are feeling the consequences and the repercussions to that war day in, day out in the Middle East. Like you said, I've already pointed out, the rise of the only thing that Tony Blair admitted, as you said, for once, is the fact that that war was the direct result of ISIS. It is the direct result of the destruction of the Middle East and the continuing destruction of the Middle East. Such countries as, Syria, which was just an amazing place to be, and the likes of Iraq and, Libya and Yemen, etc. The fact that he can actually go on national on TV and say that he
went on American
TV, not even British TV.
He guaranteed that he'd get a soft interview.
Exactly, yeah. The fact that he went on American TV just goes to show the lack of disrespect. Just before the Chilcot inquiry, to go on there and not actually say or even mention the over 1 million people that have died due to the direct actions of Tony Blair and George W. Bush is appalling. The fact that it can even be reported as an apology is appalling. How do you apologize for completely destroying a region and taking away people's lives, just as if it was nothing? The other thing is the weapons of mass destruction. He mentioned that, as you said, there were intelligence services that had pointed out several times that there was no evidence of weapons of mass destructions, several times. And there was even indications, actually, reports of that Tony Blair and George Bush had agreed, prior to even any inquiries happening, that they would, in fact, go to war and take out Saddam Hussein. Now, whether that's true or not is still yet to come to light. But
well, when you see my film, which will be out soon, The Killings of Tony Blair, you'll find out that it absolutely is true and is written down in chapter and verse. 13 months before Parliament voted
that's what I
for
heard,
the
yes.
war, Blair and Bush at Crawford, Texas, on Bush's ranch, after being down on their knees and praying together for the success of their mass murder enterprise, decided that they were going to invade, and all the rest was a deception. And if it had worked, if it had profited, we might not be having this discussion now. I'd be an ex-politician. The Stop the War Coalition, a discredited, historic organization. The fact that we're still in play is because it turned into a bloody disaster. Go ahead.
I completely agree. The fact that you said that will come out should be should be very interesting. As my comrade has already said, the complete destruction of the region is just one repercussion of that war. There's so much more that people don't actually quite realize. The rise of the fact of terror groups, the rise of Islamophobia in the region, the constant reporting from media outlets to always have a so-called boogeyman in order to validate the wars that we have been to and the killings and the destruction that we have caused people is completely just overlooked in general society. People don't quite realize how we have been nurtured, in a sense, to believe that we were right in going into this war, even though 1 million people did march, and that was my first ever march. And I've spoken to several campaigners who've said that was the catalyst in order to get into a movement and campaign and actually take back, democracy for ourselves. And like you said, that was how the Stop the War Coalition, as well as other organizations, were formed and formed alliances. But the fact that people quite ignore that so much more has happened because of the Iraq War. It has affected people across borders, not just in the Middle East, but it has affected this kind of narrative that we supposedly don't even look at the fact that that is a region completely destroyed by us, by British politicians.
Well, Asia, much more from you and from the rest of the audience after this. You're watching كلمة on Al Mayadeen television with me, George Galloway, coming from London. We're discussing Iraq, the Iraq war and occupation, and all of the reverberations that continue to thunder across the region and the world, the rivers of blood that just keep on flowing. And in particular, the responsibility of the man who used to rule from here in London for 10 long years. Tony Blair was Britain's Prime Minister. And without him, George W. Bush would almost certainly not have been able to wreak the destruction that happened now 12 years ago. We have an audience of experts and distinguished amateurs, just like me. Let's go to one of the experts. Yes, sir, go ahead.
Thank you. Khalil Khawairi, producer and show host based in London. You touched a bit earlier about on the Stop the War Coalition, just like my fellow speaker, Asia. So even members from Stop the War have complained that the coalition has lost a bit of its momentum, especially in their recent meeting this year. Now, with Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn being its chair, would that gain momentum, do you think, in the next meeting, and what would Jeremy Corbyn do about it?
Well, of course, after 12 years, it's difficult to keep up momentum, and the wars that have occurred since the Iraq war, a very great effort has been made by our rulers and their media to throw as much sand in the eyes of people as they could. And if there's anything that has surprised me more than what we did and failed to stop in 2003, it's that they have been able to pull the same trick off over and over again. First in Libya, now in Syria, the same lies from the same people, echoed by the same newspaper and broadcast journalists. It just goes to show, in a way confounding the late and great Abraham Lincoln, that you can fool enough of the people, enough of the time, to get them to at least not oppose you doing the same thing over and over again, which, as Einstein pointed out, was a sign of madness, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. We're getting the same result. So you could argue that the anti-war forces in Britain have become fatigued, confounded, and not the strength that once we were. But it would be a miracle, actually, if we could replicate that movement that we mustered against the war in Iraq on the same level. I share any responsibility that needs to be shared for any mistakes in our work. I remain, I think, the vice president, one of the vice presidents of the Stop the War Coalition. So I'm jointly responsible for any mistakes that we have made. I've always asked people who implicitly pointed out those mistakes if they had any better ideas. People would say that you can't just keep marching from A to B, or you can't just keep protesting. And I always said, please, if you have a better idea, give it to us. It's not that we don't want any better ideas, but I'm not sure what, in this kind of country, ranged against the forces that we are, what better ideas those might be. But you may have some. Please do go ahead.
Well, I'm thinking, what do you think the role of Jeremy Corbyn would be in this case?
Well, Jeremy Corbyn was one of the leaders of the Stop the War Coalition until the war, and thereafter, not long thereafter, became the president of the Stop the War Coalition and remains, I'm sure, absolutely committed to all of its goals. But as we are discovering, and discussed in a previous show actually here on كلمة, it's one thing to be in office, it's another thing to be in power. And up till now, Jeremy Corbyn has not been able to translate the overwhelming democratic mandate that he achieved in winning with almost 60% of the vote in a five-party race. He's been unable yet to translate that into power in the Parliament and in British politics. But I'm sure that he's doing his very best and doing all that he can. But he is surrounded by people who like war. He's surrounded by people on his front bench who want another war in Syria. Not that there isn't a war in Syria already, but they want us to join that war in Syria. Let's take someone else.
Hi there, my name is Hassan Al-Khatib. I've got a quick question, and that is, there are some in the in London, in the Iraqi community, who live here in London, have good links with people like Tony Blair. They think that by having good links with Tony Blair, that they will have some sort of power or a bit of influence, or that Tony Blair can benefit them or benefit the Iraqi community in some way or other. What is your advice to those people who think in this way, who think that by having good links with Tony Blair and being kind or nice or good towards him, that somehow he may be, good towards them back, or could listen to them, or could do something to help them? Specifically with Tony Blair, what's your advice to those particular people who live here in London or abroad in the Iraqi community who think like this?
Well, I have known such people in the past, and we mentioned one of them, the recently deceased Ahmed Chalabi, the bank robber. He played a very big role. He got close to the neocons in the United States and their echo here in the Blairite circles in London. And it's not that he fooled them or anything. He just, as an Iraqi, said the things that they wanted him to say and that he also wanted to say. He thought that it would propel him into power in Iraq. In the end, I think he won one seat in the parliament after the invasion and occupation of Iraq. What I would say to them, my friend, is this. These people have no interest whatsoever in the people of Iraq. They only have interests in the people of Iraq, which is a very different thing. As I always say, don't confuse these people with Christians. Christians believe in the prophets, peace be upon them. These people believe in the prophets and how to get a bigger piece of them. That's their only interest in the people of Iraq. Neither are they interested in which sect you follow in Iraq. Indeed, they don't even know, in truth, the difference between them. If you ask them to give 5 minutes of a discourse on the difference between Sunni and Shia, I promise you 99% of them would fail the test. They don't even care whether the people of Iraq are Muslims or not Muslims. You can pray, you can fast, you can do anything. They don't care about that. Their only interest was the black gold that lies under the sand in Iraq and the strategic position occupied by Iraq at the heart of the greatest energy producing region of the world. They wanted to control Iraq's resources. And as long as an Iraqi, you're prepared to let foreigners control your resources, well, they'll be your friend. But what kind of Iraqi would want foreigners to control his own country's resources? And one other point, if I may add, it's this. Any people has the right to rise up and overthrow their government. In a democracy where you can do it by voting, go ahead, be my guest. I wish we could do that here in Britain tomorrow. But if there is no democracy and there's no voting, then any people has the right to rise up by force and overthrow its regime. What they don't have the right to do is demand that I send my son to bomb their country in order to bring it about. They don't have that right. Neither do they have the right to have my support if I believe that what they plan for the country is worse than the regime they are seeking to overthrow. And I have the right to say, as I do to Al-Qaeda and ISIS, you don't have the right to demand I support your revolution, because I think your revolution is so ugly. It's uglier than sin. It's uglier than any crime I have ever seen with my eyes committed. I will never support your revolution. Just because you call it a revolution doesn't mean that a revolutionary somewhere else has to support it. Go ahead.
Well, coming on to that issue, why is it that certain rebels, say in Syria or in Iraq or in other, let's say, Sunni countries, haven't they realised that America and Britain and other countries, they're not interested in, them? They're not interested in their freedoms. Haven't they realised that? Why is it that they're always going to America for help? Why are they always asking them, to help them out? Haven't they not realised that?
Well, let's take just one strand of Sunni Muslim politics. Let's take the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood is different in every country, and it's not monolithic even within one country. But their prevailing line, historically, since the 1950s, has been to tack back and forth towards imperialism, and particularly to the United States, although Britain in the 50s played some role in their development in Egypt in particular, but also elsewhere, also in Iraq and in Syria. This is a profound mistake. And I am not a Shiite. I'm not an Iranian. But the only revolution that has remained for more than 30 years implacably opposed to American imperialism is the Iranian Revolution. And those who support the Iranian Revolution in Arab countries and around the world have similarly, by and large, been implacably opposed to foreign domination of their region, of their resources. And I don't say so for religious reasons. I say so as a practicing political activist with the evidence of my own eyes and my own experience. So the people, if you know them, I'm amazed that there are still Iraqis who still want to be friends with Tony Blair, even though he killed 1 million of their people in the war, and since, even though he killed 1 million of their people before the war in the sanctions, even though he destroyed their country, sent millions into exile, widows, children, orphans, begging, hungry, with dirty water and no power in an energy-producing country. I can't imagine what kind of an Iraqi that would be. It would certainly be an Iraqi who didn't believe that there's going to be a judgment day where they'll have to face the ultimate trial of them all. Yes, gentleman in the green shirt.
Hi there, Michael. I teach religion at a West London Catholic comprehensive school. Just to return back, if I may, to Tony Blair's lack of an apology in the recent American interview. There were 2 points he made that I'd like you to comment on, if possible. And the first was the almost petty sort of saying to other people, well, nothing you've done's worked either. He sort of said that airstrikes from above haven't worked, lack of intervention hasn't worked either. It's a tactic you do when you don't say sorry for what you've done. You say that other people haven't done any better. And the second thing he said, which was a similar type of tactic, was he said that, well, Saddam probably would have been toppled in the Arab Spring anyway, which might have come to Iraq. So I just wanted your opinion on those 2 points.
In Ireland, we call it whataboutery. What about this? What about that? Look over there, rather than focus on your own crimes and those that people are taking you to task for. Saddam Hussein was a dictator, like virtually every ruler in the Arab world, virtually from the Atlantic to the Gulf. It was a dictatorship that treated its political opposition brutally, but which had some successes to its name. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been so determined to destroy it. They said they wanted to disarm Iraq. That means it had arms. They wanted to destroy the science base in Iraq. That means it had a science base. Israel was determined to destroy Iraq because Iraq was the only Arab country that was a potential threat to Israel. Of course, when you calculate up all the blunders, mistakes and crimes of the Saddam Hussein regime, and indeed the Ba'ath Party generally, and not just in Iraq, you'd have to find them bankrupt because the actual costs of their actions compared to whatever benefits their actions produced leave a very big red mark on the ledger. As to whether Saddam would have fallen in the Arab Spring, I don't know. What I do know is this, that the people in Iraq today definitely would prefer that Saddam was still there than what they have now. Now, that's a kind of false comparison because it relies upon just how horrific things are now. I mean, it's hard to imagine that anybody could be worse than what happens in Iraq now, where nobody is secure, everybody is potentially seconds away from death, and even life is hell on earth. We'll talk to some of our Iraqi audience members about that point right after this.
نريد إزالة إسرائيل. اليوم حتى سوريا تتمنى أن تزيل إسرائيل، بس في دول عربية لا تتمنى.
جاءت الانتفاضات العربية فطالت أحداثها حركات الإسلام السياسي قبل أن تنفجر المنطقة برمتها على دوامة عنف تعززت معها الطائفيتان السياسية والدينية.
ما في حركة إسلامية بالعالم مثل حزب الله استطاعت أن تعمل تحالف مع تيار مسيحي واسع بمثل التيار الوطني الحر.
أهلا بكم إلى الجزء الرابع من الحوار مع سماحة العلامة الشيخ نعيم قاسم نائب الأمين العام لحزب الله. إسلاميون وبعد يأتيكم في الأوقات التالية.
You're watching كلمة with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen Television. Coming to you from London, discussing Tony Blair, Iraq, and the S word. Sorry, did he say it or did he not? We took the Al Mayadeen camera out into the streets of London today to hear what the people thought. Watch this.
Is the Iraq war inquiry important to you? Yes, it is.
Yes, because the stability of the Middle East is definitely important to everybody.
Yes, it is. Because it just doesn't affect my life in general, but it affects the whole of my community just as being Muslim or just being human.
To a certain extent, yes. The Middle East in general, what's happening at the moment, I do kind of feel that Western intervention in that has caused a lot of the trouble that's taking place. If you look at the Iraq war, what was happening, a lot of that was financed by America to a certain extent. And you look at these extremist groups, you want to know how they were funded. So for me, I think it is a big issue, but it's Iraq, but also the Middle East in general at the moment, with everything that's happening.
Yes, it is, because it doesn't affect like us now, but it will affect the later generation, because Muslims are having that conflict, and it does catch any revolution that's taking place. So I think it does affect us, and we should know about what's going on.
Okay, before the break, I gave my view on whether Iraq is worse now than it was before, whether Saddam would have been toppled in the Arab Spring in any case, and whether Tony Blair has a point when he says, well, nothing anybody else did worked either. I didn't deal with that point fully, but I will in due course. But I ought to let the two Iraqis that we have in the audience respond to what I have said. Sabah, please.
As far as toppling Saddam Hussein, I think actually Saddam's regime could have been toppled even before the Arab Springs. If you look back after the Kuwaiti adventure, most of the Iraqi provinces were liberated by uprising in the south of Iraq and up in Kurdistan as well. Out of the 18 Iraqi provinces, I think 12 of them were under control of the rebellions. Most of the regime's lifespan, the regime came to power in 1968. Most of that period, actually, Saddam was supported by the West and financed and armed, and all the chemical weapons we keep hearing about was supplied to him by the Americans and by Western powers as well. And I remember actually going back to a Halabja situation when Saddam used a chemical weapon against the people in Halabja. A lot of Western governments, including the Americans, blamed the Iranians for the atrocities.
For 6 months, the Americans insisted
absolutely.
It was Iran who used the weapons.
And most of the support was going for Saddam Hussein until actually Saddam invaded. And even during the Iraq-Iran war, Saddam was supported still by the West. They only fallen out with him because of the invasion of Kuwait, because he trotted on something that belongs to them, or I think they think as part of their influence, sphere of influence, and therefore Saddam is getting too big for his boots, and therefore he has to be contained. But if you look back at what's happening in Basra and the south of Iraq, in fact, the American occupation force at that time was not occupation, but American forces in Kuwait and Iraq allowed Saddam to use his helicopter gunship to fight the rebellions that's taken place, sweeping across the south of Iraq as well. So in effect, they did not want Saddam to be toppled because reservation was mentioned and highlighted by the Saudi regimes and other Gulf state regimes that toppling Saddam Hussein from power will encourage Iran to expand, and Iran influence will become much more in the area as well. So, Saddam, in my opinion, could have been toppled in 1991. And even before that, if the West did not, I remember as opposition to Saddam Hussein, we were demanding from the West not to intervene in our affairs because the regime in Iraq is entirely the responsibility of the Iraqi people. If we want to keep Saddam, let us keep Saddam. If we want to get rid of Saddam, let us get rid of Saddam. It's none of the business of British government or the American government actually to dictate to us what kind of regime we have. We don't dictate terms to the British public about who they elect every 4 years and so on. So Saddam was supported by the West, and the Iraqi people paid a heavy price from Western intervention. They either support the tyranny that existed in Iraq under Saddam Hussein, and then when the West fallen out with Saddam, the Iraqi people were inflicted upon economic sanction for many years, and then another war and occupation which lasted for 8-9 years as well. And we see the consequences of such policy in the West. The Iraqi people are what, 15 million, 20 million? If you calculate how many people live in exile and so on, it's more than a third of the Iraqi population, so 40% of the Iraqi populations actually suffer a great deal and still suffering of the consequences of such war. I was opponent of Saddam Hussein since he came to power in 1968. In fact, I was opponent of the regime which the Ba'ath participated in the coup d'etat in 1963 against the Qasim government and so on. But we, despite our objection to Saddam Hussein and opposition to Saddam Hussein, we stood with Stop the War. By the way, I was officer of Stop the War Coalition for many years. I was one of the speakers in the before the war demonstrations, as you know, George. We participated despite the fact actually that we are opponent of Saddam Hussein. But we thought that this war is not going to be against Saddam Hussein. It's going to be primarily against the Iraqi people and the interests of the Iraqi people. And this has been proven absolutely right. Because they destroyed Iraq, they got rid of Saddam, but Saddam was their stooge for 25 years. But the Iraqi people paid the price for such a policy, and they wanted the Syrian people to pay the price for their intervention as well, and the Libyan people, and the Yemeni people, and the Lebanese people. The same policy. And you mentioned something about the same forces that justify the war in 2003 are now trying to justify future adventure in Iraq, sending the Air Force to do bombardment in Iraq and in Syria and elsewhere, perhaps in the Middle East as well. And this has to stop, because we defeat American interventionists in Iraq and the British interventionists in Iraq. The people in Basra, and I quote one British officer when he said, when we went to Basra, when we go out on patrol, we see young children coming out throwing a stone at us. After about 10-15 minutes after the stone throwing, the small boys will disappear and the big boys will come out with their AK-47 to oppose us. Most of the British forces, they stayed in Basra, cooped up in their military bases and in Basra airport because they cannot venture out because of the oppositions to them. And likewise with the Americans. The Iraqi people rejected both the regime of Saddam Hussein and the occupation of their land by Britain and the United States. And they will continue to do so. The Yemeni will continue to do this likewise. And the Syrians, the courageous Syrian people, are doing likewise in Syria. And the Lebanese resistance are foiling their plans for the Middle East, for the so-called new Middle East as well.
I mean, yes, sir.
The Iraq War, we all know it was wrong, but there were Iraqis who supported it. And I think if you look back 10 years ago, in fact over a decade ago, the average Iraqi, let's say the Shia person on the streets, was not an ally of Iran, didn't really care about the Palestinians, and didn't really see America or Britain as an enemy to its country. I think the positive consequences of the Iraq war, if there were very small ones, was it, I think, changed the opinion of the Iraqi community, especially the Shia community, in knowing who their real enemy is, in knowing that the ally is Iran and the enemy is America, and their enemy is the Zionist in Israel. And I think they've just realized that, or have been realizing that for the last few years now, especially what ISIS has been doing in Iraq. They've realized, they have to be part of the axis of resistance. This is something which I'm, amazed to see in the streets of Iraq. Before, I couldn't imagine. There are now Iraqi Shia, for instance, who really support the Palestinian cause now. This was unimaginable 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago. There's many things I think they've now realized, which they, I didn't really expect them to have been, supporting or realizing, when they were, supporting Tony Blair and George Bush in allowing them to advance into Iraq. So I think it's had a very, a positive consequence, but, unfortunately it had to have, happen with all this bloodshed. They didn't realize it before, but they've realized it now. And I think if, hopefully in future they don't make the same mistake, that they've learnt their lessons now. And I think, other countries as well should look to what's happened in Iraq as a prime example of who their real enemy is and who their real ally is.
I mean, two contributions with which I wholeheartedly identify. Who'd like to make a different or an additional one? Yes, madam.
Khansa Al-Sabah, PhD candidate in economics. My question to you is, where do you see the situation in Iraq or the Middle East going? What are your future projections of that area?
Well, I'd like to provide you with an optimistic scenario, but I'd be lying. I think that the Middle East is in for a very, very long and bitter struggle. But I have faith that the people will prevail in the end. I think that the military situation in Syria has begun to turn, and that will, if it goes all the way to the defeat on the battlefield of these takfiri fanatics, these heart-eating, head-chopping, nihilistic savages, if it goes all the way to their defeat on the battlefield, that will strengthen the axis of resistance that our friend was just talking about, will strengthen and embolden them to take a stronger stand. And Russia's contribution to the defeat of that enemy will make Russia bigger and stronger and embolden Russia to decide, well, now that we're here, there are one or two other things we have to help to bring about a resolution to. For example, although this is not the point of view, none of this is the point of view of Al-Mayadeen, it's my point of view and your point of view. That's why it's called Kalima Horra. But my point of view is that the Iraqi government should ask Russia for its help in defeating the same people who are occupying a substantial part of Iraq. It's my belief that the Palestinian people should ask Russia to exert its strength in the Israel-Palestine theater, because nobody else will. And Russia has forces in the area. Russia has and will have, in those circumstances, a very powerful position on the international stage. I would like myself to see Russia have an ongoing role in the area. I spent the best years of my life cursing Sykes and Picot. It never occurred to me that something worse than Sykes and Picot could come to pass. It never occurred to me that one day I might wish that we could go back to Sykes-Picot. For those who don't know, here in the audience, this was the Anglo-French division of the Arab world into what became 23 Arab states. Now we have the possibility of 500 Arab Emirates all fighting each other, preferably from the point of view of the West based on confession, religion, sect, all fighting each other, all needing an army and an air force, all needing all the paraphernalia that our weapons dealers can sell them. That's one ending that is possible. It's possible. Because in my experience, which is now a long one, the Arabs and the Muslims don't need much encouragement to be divided. Some of us like to blame the Khawarija, blame the Americans, blame the British, blame the Turkish, blame the Israelis. But in fact, in the Muslim Ummah, it's not hard to create division between people. And so one outcome, the disaster outcome, would be hundreds of emirates in the Arab world, and the Arabs would be set back by centuries. But the best case would be if the outcome of all these great struggles was some kind of movement towards unity amongst the Arabs, a people of 350 million, with one language, one God, a common culture and history, all this land, all this water, all this oil, all this gas, could be a superpower, could be a power that nobody in the world could ignore. That's the best outcome. We'll see in the next segment whether people agree with me or not. We'll be right back. You're watching كلمة on Al Mayadeen Television with me, George Galloway. We're talking with a very distinguished audience here this evening, but we took the cameras out onto the streets of London to hear the voice of the people. Watch this.
And you know that Blair has apologized and said that it was a mistake. What do you think of this remark?
I think he should have realised before, because he ruined so many lives. Like, you have wars that are going on now because of what he did.
I think it's an apology far, far too late. And it completely conceals his collusion with Bush and others. You know, it's far, far too late. And what's needed is much, much more than an apology. It's futile.
You know, yeah, it's done what it's done. You can't go back.
And do you think that Blair and Bush and all those people who backed them up for Iraq war, they should be held responsible?
Yeah, they're all responsible. Yeah, they are all responsible. They shouldn't have gone in. It was a mistake.
No, I don't think he's directly responsible for it. The responsibility really lies on the coalition and the fact that they had no understanding of the complexities of the divisions within Iraq. They went in without any historical knowledge, any geopolitical knowledge. It was an absolute disaster. So the blame has to be shared.
Do you think that Blair should go to jail for war crimes?
He should, yeah. But then if you look at Blair, then a lot of other leaders should then go to jail. Netanyahu being one.
Yeah, in my opinion, yeah, he definitely should be, because thousands of children and adults, women, men, like elderly, they all like died and stuff.
Asia Othman is from the Stop the War Coalition. Let's hear again from her.
Just to kind of touch up on a point that you raised earlier regarding the anti-war movement as general. I think George did mention that after 12 years it does get a bit tiresome. But I would just like to say that obviously there has still been quite a bit of, unity, and they are still opposing wars constantly, the Libya, obviously the Syrian intervention, the lobbying of MPs and several other several other campaigns that have been going on. And of course, whether Jeremy manages to actually gain a bit more power and influence is something that I guess we will just have to wait and see. Just regarding everything else on the whole of Middle East, I think she was saying that what will happen in the region. And as you said, the splitting up of several emirates could be something that maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago would seem a bit absurd, but now seems more likely than ever. The more that this war goes on and the more that the foreign policy, the fact that our foreign policy has in fact created this, just means that we will face years and years of not only terrorism, of not only constant bombardment, not only other countries looking over their shoulder, everybody thinking, is he out to get me? The fact that sectarianism in the Middle East has grown is something that's not really touched upon, and that is something that is fed by the fact of the invasion and of foreign policy of the British and the US, and that is something that they do use to divide and conquer people. And in order to get more resources, in order to get more allies, and when those allies don't appease them or do not suffice to what they would like them to, then they are suddenly called terrorists. It always amazed me that how Saddam Hussein was an ally at one point, a very good ally of the British and the US, and then suddenly overnight, not overnight, but suddenly he was the worst enemy. He was the worst man alive that needed to be taken out. The Iraqi people needed to be saved from that dictatorship. And a lot of people overlook that, generally speaking. They'll overlook that, who are we in the West to dictate how other countries should be run or who they should be run by? And you have to look at the dire situation, the humanitarian situation, the fact that there are thousands and thousands in exile. And this is not just one country. This is Syria, it's Libya, Yemen with the rise. And it will continue to do so, just like you said, until people actually realize that the British and the US and all these other countries are not in fact our allies, but our enemies. And until there is a common unity that of the people, for their countries, then I believe that there won't be stability in those countries and in that region until we actually realize that we have to take back, and the Iraqi people, the Syrian people, the Middle Eastern people in general realize that they need to take back democracy into their hands and not actually go back to imperialism and colonization and which is the mentality that they seem to have now. Then we won't have peace in there. And that absurd notion a few years ago might have been absurd to think that there could be 2, 3, 4, 500 emirate states all fighting each other. But to be honest, it doesn't look so absurd now, really.
No, it doesn't. And as that great philosopher Bob Marley said, emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but yourself can free your mind. And that's an overwhelming requirement of the people in the Arab world. If you have a colonial mentality, or let me put it another way, if you don't respect yourself, why would anybody else respect you? If you want foreigners to come and run you, bomb you, invade you, occupy you, transfer power from one hand to another, dominate your resources and profit from them, why would anybody respect you? They will laugh behind their hand and come and take everything that they can. The point you make about the demonization is a very good one. And although I wasn't around, I'm not as old as I look, the Mahdi was the first of the demons. The British press and political class at the turn of the 19th to 20th century painted a picture of this mad Mahdi who was seeking to swarm across the Islamic world and might be even headed for Pall Mall and Piccadilly. And there's been a whole range of them ever since. President Nasser was called by the British Prime Minister Anthony Eden the mad dog of Cairo. Who will help me chain the mad dog of Cairo? said the British Prime Minister, Anthony Eden. Yasser Arafat was a demon for a while, and then he was a teddy bear, and then he became a demon again, and then a teddy bear, and I lost count of the number of changes that he had. There have been Saddam Hussein, there has been the Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad, Said Hassan Nasrallah. I'm no doubt I've missed many. But it's amazing how people fall for it. Suddenly somebody is the new Hitler. And the most extraordinary cynicism is this. We were told for fully 2 years, day and daily, that ISIS were the greatest threat to humanity on the planet, until Russia started bombing them and helping to destroy them, at which point Russia was a much worse enemy than ISIS were. And it turns out, if the West were bombing ISIS, they were bombing in the wrong places. I wonder how that could have been. Let's take, yes, this lady here.
Hello, my name is Rana and I'm activist. Starting from talking about ISIS, America and the West never bombed ISIS. They were throwing weapons at them, and it's like they're drawing a fence for them. You can do whatever you want in this surrounding, but don't go out of it. And also about standing with some government and not with others. We can see that they're playing double standards policy toward all the Middle East. So while they say in Bahrain, in Saudi Arabia, reforms are, the people and the government should negotiate. And we know that their leaders are behind bars, and they keep saying, oh, they have to sit and negotiate about it. While government there is killing their people. In Yemen, because the Yemeni people and the Houthi stood with Iran, saying that they want the end of Israel. So literally they're standing with the Palestinian people. Also Syria is the most Arab country, or the only Arab country standing with the Palestinian, whether they appreciate it or not. A lot of them becoming terrorists now, and some of them are going to bomb in Iraq and in Syria, while many other Palestinians are fighting with President Assad. So the West, and especially America and the UK, they say, oh, in Syria we want to get rid of the tyrant. In Iraq we want to destroy it. In Yemen we want to end the presence of the Houthi. When in other countries they want, they stand with the people who are with Israel, and they try to get rid of the people who are against Israel. This is the only way the whole world is divided. USA, UK, they stand with Israel and their allies, and against whoever causes a threat to Israel.
It's not democracy, it's hypocrisy.
It is hypocrisy.
Mrs. Clinton convened a group a few years back now called the Friends of Democratic Syria. But as its leading members and funders were one tyranny and dictatorship after another, they dropped the word democratic because they realized that it would seem absurd. Even to the dogs in the street would be laughing at the idea that, for example, Saudi Arabia could be a friend of democratic Syria when there is no democracy of any kind in Saudi Arabia. Now, we're running out of time, so let me go to anyone who's not spoken yet or who has a pressing need to speak again. Yes, sir?
The Chilcot inquiry, we've been waiting for now for several years. When's it coming out? And I really don't believe that it will do justice to, the perpetrators of the Iraq war. I think it's probably going to be a whitewash. I have no faith in it. When will we really see people like Tony Blair be put to justice? Because I don't think this inquiry will do that.
Well, let me risk having egg on my face. I don't believe it will be a whitewash, because I believe that the British ruling class has decided to sacrifice Tony Blair. They have decided that he's of no longer any use to them and that he has now become a liability to them. And I think that's one of the reasons why he made the non-apology apology, because he can feel the sharks coming towards him in the water. I may be wrong, but that's my honest opinion. I described the Chilcot inquiry when it was set up, 8 years ago, Is it 8? Can it really be 8? No, it was Gordon Brown in 2008, so 7 years ago, coming up for 8 years ago. Its last witness was heard 5 years ago. So for 5 years, they've been working on the report itself. But I described them when Gordon Brown announced them as a parade of establishment flunkies. The membership of the panel, the terms of the inquiry, its terms of reference, and the fact that it could not command papers and people, would not hear from people like me, even though I knew Iraq, had been to Iraq many more times than any other British politician. I was the only person to meet Saddam Hussein. I was the only person who could give them any kind of, because the embassy had long gone, any kind of, but they didn't want to speak to me. I've got collapsed expectations over these years, to be sure. But I now believe that so disastrous, you know, Shakespeare said, treason never prospers, for if it prospers, none dare call it treason. If this enterprise had been a success, we'd all be out of business. But because it was such a catastrophic failure, I think the British ruling elite knows that unless they make a sacrifice of Tony Blair in front of the public and the world, that they will be even more discredited and enfeebled than they now are. It's going to be reporting in June or July of 2016. But don't hold your breath. I've been George Galloway. This has been كلمة for Al Mayadeen Television with a wonderful audience here in London.